What if the person meant to change your life appeared when you'd already stopped believing in love? Not every love story begins with fate. Some begin with a choice. In a place you never meant to be, October's breath swept through ivory heights, a city carved from ambition and asphalt. The wind carried the scent of rain and rust, curling through narrow streets, lit by gold-tinted street lamps. High above, on the 54th floor of a glass monolith, Damien Vale stood by a wall of windows, watching the world move without him. Cars blinked below like restless stars. Inside the silence of his office, the weight of inheritance pressed on his shoulders like iron. At 32, Damien had everything: wealth, status, control, but what he lacked, no title could grant. His reflection stared back at him, sharp jaw, dark eyes, hair always in place. To the world he was unshakable. But behind that polished exterior lived a truth he shared with no one. He did not believe in love. Not after what he'd seen it do, how it disappointed, demanded, and eventually disappeared. That morning, his father's voice had rung out across the marble boardroom. Cold final, marry before your 33rd birthday, or lose the company. No room for protest, no care for desire, just a transaction, disguised as tradition. Damien didn't flinch, he never did, but inside something curled in protest. He wasn't a man who bent for rules, and certainly not for love, a concept he considered just another tool for leverage. So when an invitation arrived that evening, unsigned, curious, oddly timed, he accepted, not out of interest, but out of defiance. A private charity auction, an evening unlike any you've known, it promised. He arrived at the Solace Room, a hidden parlor within the Grand Briarcrest Hotel, where the elite gathered in hushed anticipation. The chandeliers shimmered above velvet drapes, the air thick with perfume and performance. One by one, women were presented, elegant, poised, mysterious. Each offered not themselves, but the illusion of connection. For the highest bidder, Damien remained seated, detached, swirling his drink, measuring every movement with practiced indifference. He wasn't looking for company. He was looking for proof that everything, including people, had a price. And then she stepped onto the stage. Clara, when 24, she didn't walk like the others, didn't pose, didn't charm. She simply stood, white dress, bare shoulders, hair falling naturally, eyes wide but unafraid. She didn't sparkle, she glowed. The room stilled. Damien sat forward, something unfamiliar fluttering beneath his ribs. He didn't know her name until seconds ago, but somehow it felt like she'd been quietly written into his story all along. He didn't believe in fate, but something about Clara Wynne felt like it. She stepped forward slowly, like someone unsure if they belonged. Her dress was simple, ivory cotton that fell just below the knee. No jewelry, no pretense. Just her soft brown hair, hung loosely, curling gently around a face that seemed both young and quietly weathered, and her eyes, wide, warm, uncertain, held the kind of sadness that doesn't come from weakness, but from enduring too much too soon. The room, once humming with idle chatter, grew still. For the first time all evening, Julian Hale leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. His brow creased. He didn't understand it. This tug beneath his ribs. Just another girl, he told himself, but his gaze refused to move on. The bidding began, 10,000, 20, 50. Then a man near the center of the room, older, smug, the kind whose hands always reached for too much, raised his paddle. 100,000, he said, as if this were just another investment. Julian's jaw tightened. The girl, Isla, stood, rigid, under the chandelier's light, pale, her fingers locked together. She didn't want to be there. That was obvious. And that made Julian wonder, why is she here? He didn't blink, didn't shift in his seat. He simply raised his paddle and said evenly, 1 million. The air cracked like glass. The entire room turned to him. Even the host faltered. 1 million. From Mr. Hale, any further bids? Silence. Isla's head turned, her eyes meeting his. Startled, confused, afraid she didn't understand, and maybe neither did he. Julian stood, slowly, buttoned his jacket, and gave the room a glance that said, "Don't ask." He wasn't bidding for company. He was making a statement to his father, to the board, to himself. He wouldn't be controlled. When the auction ended, Isla was led to him. Up close, she looked even smaller, as if the city might swallow her if she stood still too long. "Miss Reed," he said formally, extending his hand like he was closing a deal one evening as agreed. She hesitated, then took it. Her hand was cold, her grip tentative, but it made him pause for just a moment, because something in that simple, human touch whispered, "This isn't just a transaction." They stepped into the city's cold embrace together. The night was quiet, the air sharp with October wind. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them realized that this night would change everything. A few miles away, on the quiet edge of Brooklyn's Eastwood district, Isla Reed stood behind the worn counter of Willow and Sage Bakery. The warm scent of cinnamon and butter hung in the air as she wrapped cookies with careful fingers, her apron dusted with flour. At 22, she carried herself with grace. Though life had rarely been kind, her eyes, soft brown, like the inside of a chestnut, held stories she rarely told. Her smile, gentle and practiced, could warm any customer who stepped through the door, but behind that smile lived a weight she could never quite set down. Her world had been small since she was 15, since the car crash that took her parents and left her raising her baby sister Lila alone. She'd given up college dreams without question. She worked through the silence and the sorrow, waitressing, cleaning, delivering newspapers before dawn, and now baking from sunrise to closing time. Everything she earned went to Lila because Lila at 16 lived with a heart condition that didn't wait for paychecks or mercy. Lila had learned to stretch dollars like ribbon to pray in moments she didn't even realize were prayers, and on the night she stood on that stage, she wasn't looking to be saved, she was just trying to save someone else. Lila was Isla's reason for everything, the reason she opened her eyes each morning when sleep had barely kissed her eyelids, the reason she smiled through aching muscles and double shifts, the reason her heart beat stronger than her exhaustion. But Lila's heart wasn't holding on the same way. The episodes were becoming more frequent: sharp pain, shallow breath, rushed ambulance rides. And a week ago, the doctor took Isla Abbott, his voice heavy like rain. "She needs a transplant and soon, the surgery. It's $2,000. Without it, she won't have more than 3 months." That night, Isla sat by her sister's hospital bed, holding her fragile hand, brushing the hair from her damp forehead. Lila, even in her pale silence, had smiled. Isla had smiled back. But inside, she was breaking. She sold what little she had, her mother's silver necklace, the last piece of family that hadn't already been taken. She borrowed from anyone who could bear to listen, but all she had, after days of desperate pleading, was barely a few thousand babkuts. That's when Sarah, a former coworker with sharp eyes and a whisper-soft voice, appeared. "There's another way," she said. She explained the auction, a night just dinner, nothing more wealthy. Men, powerful names, all under the guise of charity. It's safe. You'll earn more in one night than you could in a year. You can walk away after. Isla flinched. She wasn't naive, but the thought of being offered up like a product, a price tag, around her dignity, felt like a quiet betrayal of who she was. But then she looked back at the hospital, at the monitors, at the girl who had no one else. "Just one night," she whispered to herself. She signed the contract, her hand trembling. "Dinner only," she repeated. The organizer nodded politely, but Isla missed the way their eyes slid past hers, calculating, cold. She thought she was walking into a simple exchange. She didn't know she was stepping onto a stage. where choice wasn't always hers to keep. The night of the auction, Isla stood behind the crimson curtains of the Roslyn Hotel ballroom, her hands trembling as they clutched the edge of her dress. She heard laughter echo beyond the walls, applause, names called, lives being weighed and whispered over cocktails. When her name was called, she took a breath that didn't reach her lungs and walked into the light. Chandeliers sparkled above. Eyes watched from every corner. She felt like a bird exposed in a glass cage. Isla Reed, 22 years old, a gentle heart, a soft presence, a girl with light in her soul. She forced a smile. Her lips barely holding, the bidding began. 10 to 1,000, 50,000, 100,000. Isla kept her gaze low, praying for the final gavel, aching to return to Lila to real life. Then came a voice, low, sharp, and devastatingly clear. 1 million. Everything stopped. Her head rose instinctively. Her eyes met a man's across the room, tall, dressed in black expression, unreadable. Eyes like winter storms, cold, controlled, and cutting. She didn't know his name, but something in the silence whispered. It was Julian Hale. After the auction, they brought her to him. She stood there, all nerves and numbness, staring up at the man who'd just bought an evening of her time. Miss Reed, he said, extending a hand with the cool precision of a contract negotiation. She took it, if only because she didn't know what else to do. Why, she asked softly. Why would you do that? Julian looked at her, then smirked. To prove a point, he said, voice laced with quiet mockery, that everything, even you, has a price. He leaned in, slightly, like revealing a cruel truth wrapped in charm. One night, 1 million. Honestly, cheaper than I expected. His words cut sharper than she imagined they could. But what? He didn't know. Was that Isla? Reed had already sold pieces of herself long before tonight, and he was about to find out. Some things can't be bought. His words cut deep, like a blade wrapped in velvet. But Isla didn't flinch, her fists clenched at her sides, her voice trembling but unyielding. You can buy my time, she said, her eyes locked on his, but not my self-respect. Julian Hale paused, a flicker of surprise breaking through his polished indifference. But it was gone just as quickly, hidden beneath his usual detachment. We'll see, he said, coolly, turning on his heel and motioning for her to follow. They arrived at La Reserve, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Candlelight reflected off crystal glassware, casting golden glows across linen-covered tables. But the warmth of the room did nothing to melt the chill between them. Isla sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She kept her focus on the plate in front of her, not on the man watching her. With the sharp intensity of someone used to control, she told herself to stay quiet, think of Lila, think of the surgery, just get through the night. But what she couldn't know was that she hadn't simply stepped into a fancy restaurant. She had stepped into Julian Hale's world, an empire built on ice and fire, money and silence. And without realizing it, she had become the one thing that world wasn't prepared for, a woman who didn't want anything from him, except her dignity. The dinner had ended hours ago, but Julian was still awake, his thoughts. A tangle of things he didn't have names for. He couldn't stop replaying that moment. Her voice, calm but clear. You can buy my time, but not my self-respect. She didn't ask about his wealth, didn't flatter him. She didn't flirt or pretend. She'd simply endured gracefully, quietly, like someone who had weathered far worse than him. And for the first time in years, he was intrigued. The next morning, Julian sat in his glass-walled office, overlooking Central Park, the city alive beneath him. A file sat on his desk, delivered promptly by his assistant. Isla Reed. It was thin, no scandals, no debts, no digital trail. Just fragments of a life lived far from luxury. Parents deceased, guardian of a younger sister with a life-threatening heart condition. Current job, bakery assistant at Willow and Sage, a family-owned shop in Eastwood. There was a photo clipped to the file, her, in an apron, flower on her cheek, smiling gently at a customer. She looked at peace, unarmored, real. The contrast between her world and his could not have been starker. And yet something about her quiet strength lingered like a question he couldn't answer. Why had she agreed to that night? The answer, of course, was in the paperwork, hospital bills, insurance rejections, desperation. She hadn't lingered after the auction, hadn't hinted at a second meeting, hadn't once tried to stay in his orbit. She was the only person he'd met in years who hadn't wanted anything from him, and that made her dangerously unforgettable. His father's demand loomed in the back of his mind: marry by the end of the year, or lose the company, a corporate marriage, loveless, lifeless, handpicked by people who valued legacy over choice. Julian felt a familiar wave of disdain rise in him, but Ela was different. What if he thought this could work? Not love, not romance, just a contract, a year, a name on a marriage license. She needed money, he needed a wife, nothing more. It was perfect. Clean, simple. At least, it seemed that way. 1 week later, Julian Hale pushed open the door of Willow and Sage Bakery. A bell chimed, and the scent of fresh bread wrapped around him like memory. He didn't belong here, his presence cutting through the cozy space like a sharp edge. But none of that mattered, because across the counter, her back turned, was Isla Reed, and this time, he hadn't come to test her. He'd come to make an offer that would change everything. Behind the counter at Willow and Sage, Isla wiped her hands on her apron, her hair tucked behind her ears, dusted lightly with flour, and then she looked up and froze. Standing in the doorway like a shadow that didn't belong was Julian Hale. She blinked. Unsure she was seeing right, Hale? She asked, her voice cautious. "What are you doing here?" Julian didn't waste time. "I have a proposal," he said, simply, gesturing to a small table tucked near the window. After a long hesitation, Isla followed. She sat down, but her eyes never left his. Julian leaned forward, voice low and deliberate. "Marry me." For 1 year, her breath caught. "I'll cover everything. Your sister's surgery, treatment, recovery, all of it. You'll live comfortably. You'll have privacy. And in return, you'll play the role of my wife. Public appearances, dinners. The illusion of a relationship. That's it." Isla stared at him as if waiting for the punchline. "You're serious?" she whispered. "Why me?" she asked. "You could choose anyone." He hesitated just a second. "Because you're not part of my world," he said flatly. "You don't want anything from me." "That makes this clean." His words felt clinical, detached, but the truth was more complicated. One he wasn't ready to admit, even to himself. "This isn't about love or feelings. Just business." Isla's hands trembled in her lap. It was everything she needed, a miracle, a door. But it came at a cost she couldn't measure in dollars, to marry a man she barely knew, to step into a life that was all surface and no soul. It terrified her. She thought of Lila lying in that hospital bed, whispering about one day seeing the ocean. Her heart twisted. "I need time," she said quietly. Julian nodded and slid a sleek business card across the table. 24 hours. That night, Isla sat beside Lila's bed. The beeping of the monitors filled the silence like a lullaby she'd never wanted to learn. Her sister was sleeping barely, her breaths shallow like petals folding inward. Isla held her hand, tears slipping down her cheeks. Without sound, she imagined her little sister healed, running, laughing, breathing without pain. And then she thought of Julian Hale, his cold, unshakable gaze, his world of contracts and control. Could she survive, being his wife? Even for a year, she didn't know. But she knew this. She couldn't survive losing Lila. The next morning, Isla dialed the number on the card. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. "I'll do it," she said. 1 year, for my sister, nothing more. There was a pause on the other end. Understood, Julian replied. My legal team will send the paperwork. You'll move in by the weekend. The contract arrived the next day, pages upon pages of legal clauses, each one carefully worded to eliminate misunderstanding. 1 year. No expectations of emotional or physical intimacy. A monthly stipend for Isla, full coverage of Lila's medical care. It read like a business merger because that's exactly what it was. Isla packed in silence. A few clothes, a worn-out copy of Anne of Green Gables, a photo of her and Lila on the boardwalk before everything changed, and with that, she left behind the only life she'd ever known. Julian Hale's penthouse was everything her life was not. Glass steel silence. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city like a kingdom he owned. Every object had a place, every surface gleamed, but it felt less like a home, and more like a museum of solitude. He greeted her with a nod, offering no smile. Your room is down the hall, he said. If you need anything, the staff can arrange it. Isla clutched her bag tighter. Thank you, she said softly. Even though her voice felt borrowed, she was here for Lila, that was all. The first weeks passed like a dream she couldn't wake from. Julian was rarely home, always in meetings, always at events. He existed on headlines and handshakes, always polished, always distant, and Ela. She drifted like a ghost through marble floors and mirrored halls. She didn't belong here, but she stayed because her sister's life depended on it. In the first few weeks, their lives passed like two parallel lines, close but never crossing. When they did speak, it was polite. Formal like strangers, boarding the same train, but sitting rows apart. Isla spent most of her days at the hospital. Lila's condition had stabilized the promise of surgery, bringing a fragile sense of hope neither of them had dared to hold on to before Isla poured herself into those quiet hours, reading to her sister, feeding her soup, watching over her like she had for years. The luxuries of Julian's world felt foreign. The designer clothing in her wardrobe remained untouched. The private driver often waited downstairs, for no one. She preferred walking, cooking, doing things with her hands. She made humble meals, vegetable stew, tomato pasta, and always left an extra portion in the fridge. She never knew if he ate them, but Julian noticed. He saw the way she folded her clothes neatly, refusing the staff's help. He noticed the worn paperback she read at night, her fingers brushing over the pages like she was touching something sacred. He heard her humming soft and unintentional melodies that lingered in the quiet corners of his mind. Isla didn't belong in his world, but somehow she grounded it. One evening, after a brutal day of boardroom battles and clipped negotiations, Julian walked through the penthouse doors and stopped short. The scent hit him. First onions, garlic thyme, and then the sight. Isla stood at the stove, hair tied back loosely, stirring a pot with quiet focus. He didn't know what startled him more, that she was cooking, or that it felt like home. What are you doing? He asked more sharply than he meant. She jumped, slightly, almost dropping the ladle. I just soup, she said, cheeks pink. I thought, maybe you hadn't eaten? He didn't respond, just walked over and sat at the counter. When she handed him a bowl, he took it without a word. It was simple, carrots, potatoes, broth with herbs, but it warmed something in him that had long gone cold. Not just his body, something deeper. For the first time in years, he felt still. Their marriage was a contract, a line drawn on paper, a deal struck in desperation. In public, they played the roles expected of them. He stood tall in black tie affairs, his hand resting lightly on Isla's back, introducing her as his wife. She wore the gowns, smiled when spoken to, looked the part, and yet Behind closed doors, they were still strangers. Until they weren't, Julian found himself watching her more. The way she laughed softly with the nurses. "Ibayad tipipoit." The quiet strength and how she held Lila's hand during rougher days, the grace she carried, even when no one was watching, and then something he didn't expect fear, not of her, but of the day she would leave. Because when the year was over, when Lila was well, and Isla no longer needed the contract, she'd go and he would lose the only person who had ever looked at him, and seeing nothing to gain, he began to wonder, could I ask her to stay, not for money, not for the deal? But for me, Ela felt the shift too, the way Julian lingered in the doorway when she cooked, the gentleness in his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking, the silence between them. It no longer felt empty. It felt full of questions. Neither dared to voice. She told herself to ignore it, to remember the terms. But late at night, when the city lights glimmered outside her window and the hum of the penthouse faded, she felt it. Something was growing, something dangerous, something that could break her if she let it. They were dancing a line they had never meant to approach, a balance of closeness and restraint. And as the months passed, the contract they once clung to began to blur. 3 months after Isla Reed walked into Julian Hale's life, his penthouse was no longer just glass and silence. It had warmth, music, soup in the fridge, and the quiet, unfamiliar ache of something like love. She never tried to impress him. And maybe that's what impressed him the most. Isla moved through Julian's world like a quiet breeze through glass halls, present but never intrusive. She didn't touch his money, barely wore the designer clothes left in her closet, and still took the subway to the hospital where Lila was now slowly recovering. She folded her own clothes, washed her own cups, read the same book over and over in the quiet corners of the penthouse. She didn't try to change his world, but somehow her presence softened it. Julian, used to grandeur, to boardroom wars, and women who treated him like a prize to win, barely noticed at first. He was often away, events, meetings, mergers. In public, they played their parts, the poised CEO and his elegant wife. In photos, they looked perfect, but late at night, when he came home drained and wordless, Isla's quietness met him like a balm. One evening, after an especially brutal meeting with shareholders, Julian returned to find a faint warmth coming from the kitchen. She was there, hair tied up loosely, an old t-shirt dusted with flour, stirring something on the stove. The scent of chicken soup drifted through the air, real soup, not plated art or fine dining. Just warmth in a pot? Isla turned and startled at the sight of him. "I made soup," she said, cheeks pink. "I thought maybe—" "You were hungry?" Julian blinked. He wasn't sure what surprised him more, that she cooked, or that it mattered. "You didn't have to," he said, his voice quieter than usual. But he sat at the counter, and when she handed him the bowl, he took it like it was something sacred. Carrots, potatoes, a few herbs, nothing extravagant, but it warmed him in a place he didn't know was cold. He didn't say much, just ate quietly, spoon by spoon, while Isla cleaned up beside him. And for the first time in a long time, Julian Hale felt human. After that night, he began to see her differently. She never touched her allowance, never showed off her title. She kept rereading that same worn book. The corners curled from use, and she hummed when she wiped the table, gentle tunes he found himself waiting for. She didn't fill the space with noise, she filled it with meaning. One afternoon, Isla returned from the hospital, holding a small, lumpy box. "Lila made something for you," she said softly. Inside was a clumsy paper crane, folded with more love than skill. Julian held it delicately, his thumb brushing along its uneven wings. He tried to fold one in return. Later that night, it collapsed into a crumpled mess. Isla laughed. A little more. Practice, Mr. Hale, she teased. And just like that, his heart skipped. Moments like that began to pile up, unexpected, gentle healing. She listened. When he talked, really listened. Even when the words were jagged and edged with the weight of his father's expectations. She didn't flinch, didn't judge. She cried when the surgeon said Lila would be okay. Julian, without thinking, pulled her into his arms. She's going to be all right, he whispered, and for once he held someone not out of duty, but out of feeling. Isla didn't pull away, and in that moment he knew they'd crossed a line no contract had written. They began to share little things just between them. One night, Isla convinced him to watch The Sound of Music on TV. Julian rolled his eyes, but sat beside her anyway. Arms crossed, feigning annoyance. She sang along under her breath. He pretended not to notice, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. And for once, the penthouse wasn't just walls and windows. It was home. She was humming again. Curled into the corner of the couch, a worn blanket draped over her knees, Isla sang softly along with the movie playing on the television. Edelweiss, her voice clear, untrained, but unshakably pure. Julian was across the room pretending to read the financial reports on his tablet. But he wasn't reading. He was listening. Watching you sing beautifully, he said quietly. Isla looked up, startled, cheeks coloring. Oh, it's just something I do for fun. But to Julian, it wasn't just for fun. It was a glimpse of something untouched by pain or performance. Something he didn't even realize he was longing for until he heard it. Without meaning to, Julian began changing. He canceled dinners, rescheduled meetings, found any reason to come home earlier. He passed a roadside flower vendor one evening and paused. There were roses, yes, elegant, expensive, but he didn't choose them. He picked a bunch of white daisies, simple, unassuming, honest like her. When he handed them to Isla, he looked nervous. I thought these suited you. She took them with wide eyes, surprised, then smiled, and that smile quiet, real, grateful, did something to him. It made time stop, and he wished desperately that it wouldn't start again. Julian didn't know how to name what was happening to him. All he knew was that for the first time, he wanted someone to stay, not because of a contract, not because of obligation, but because he'd begun imagining a life with her, a life where she stayed because she wanted to. One night, Isla had drifted to sleep on the couch, her fingers still curled around a book, her head resting gently against a cushion. Julian stood nearby, the lamp casting a soft golden glow over her face. He watched her breathe. Her lashes trembled slightly, her lips barely parted. He moved slowly, quietly draping a blanket over her shoulders. And in that moment, barely audible, he whispered, "If I asked you for real, would you say yes?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, but it was already the truth. Julian Hale was in love. He started thinking about ending the contract early, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to stand before her, not with papers, but with a heart laid bare. He wanted to ask her to stay, not for Lila, not for the apartment, but for him, and yet he hesitated. Not out of fear, she'd say no, but because she might think he was manipulating her, that it was another game, another price tag. He needed to show her it was real, that he was real. Isla felt it too. She noticed the way Julian looked at her, now not cold, but soft, as if he saw something precious and was afraid to break it. He asked about Lila's recovery, not out of duty, but with genuine concern. He lingered in the kitchen, just to hear her hum. He showed up at the hospital, unannounced, just to drive her home, in the rain. None of it was written in the contract. And that's what made it dangerous and beautiful. She began to wonder, what if this wasn't pretend anymore? But she was afraid to believe it, afraid to hope. After all, Julian Hale didn't believe in love. He'd said so himself. Still, the daisies. The clumsy paper crane he folded for Lila. The quiet way he listened. The warmth in his silence. They made her heart waver. Maybe, just maybe, something real was blooming between them. They were standing on the edge of something tender and terrifying. No longer two strangers playing roles, but two people holding their breath, afraid to fall. And afraid not to. Julian was ready to let go of the walls, to tell her he loved her. But what he didn't know was that just as he was ready to open his heart, a storm was already on its way. A misunderstanding was coming, one that would unravel everything they'd slowly built. And the love they were only beginning to admit would soon be tested in ways neither of them could foresee. Winter wrapped Ivory Heights in a soft silver hush. The trees stood bare against a pale sky, and the streets sparkled with thin frost. But inside Julian Hale's chest, something tender had begun to glow, quiet and insistent. He had once believed that everything had a price, that even connection could be negotiated, but not anymore. Not since Isla. It wasn't just her kindness or patience, it was the way she existed, whole and unpolished in a world that demanded perfection. Every time she smiled without pretense, every meal she left on the stove, every night she sat quietly, reading beside him. It chipped away at the walls around his heart. He hadn't said it, not yet, but he knew it. He wanted her, not for a year, not as part of an agreement, but forever. And just as that truth settled into his bones, fate moved quietly to shatter it. Isla felt the change too. She no longer called him Mr. Hale behind closed doors. She'd catch herself smiling when she heard his footsteps enter the kitchen, or when he'd stop by the hospital. Without warning, she told herself it was nothing, that it couldn't be real, but her heart refused to obey. Each bouquet of white daisies, each moment he waited outside Lila's room without being asked, each soft question he asked about her day, little by little, Isla was falling in love with him. And it scared her more than anything because their marriage was still a contract. And the closer it felt to something real, the more fragile her heart became. Far from their quiet, blooming world, Sophie Hale watched it all unfold with growing unease. At 26, she was brilliant, beautiful, and used to being the most important person in her brother's life. Julian had always been her protector, her shield from consequence, her constant. But now, someone else was holding that place. Isla. Sophie didn't understand Isla's quiet strength, didn't trust it, and certainly didn't like how Julian smiled now, how his sharpness softened when Isla was in the room. She's not like us, Sophie whispered to herself, but deep down she knew Isla was nothing like the women who had come before, and that made her dangerous. Sophie made a decision. She hired a private investigator to follow Isla. Not because she had proof, but because she wanted to find something. That's when Ethan appeared. Isla's childhood best friend, a kind man recently returned from overseas, an engineer, someone with a long, quiet history. With Isla and Lila, he offered help. Isla declined, but he visited Lila anyway, bringing flowers and light conversation. And one afternoon, when Isla broke down from exhaustion and fear, he hugged her. Just for a moment, a gesture of comfort, of familiarity, but it was enough. Sophie's photographer captured the embrace. She hired someone to manipulate the image, soften the lighting, adjust the angles, turning a platonic moment into something intimate. Then came the fabricated messages, a thread of lies, arranged to look like Isla had been confiding in Ethan, plotting, using Julian. She sealed the photos and messages in an envelope. On the front, she scrawled, "Julian, she's not who you think she is. I warned you. Sophie." That evening, Julian returned to the penthouse. His heart was full. He had planned to sit Isla down, tear up the contract, and ask her to stay. Not out of obligation, but because he loved her. But then, his phone buzzed, a message from Sophie. He opened it. The photo, the hug, the way Isla's face leaned into Ethan's shoulder, the false intimacy. Julian's heart stopped. The warmth in his chest turned to ice. The woman he had opened his life to, trusted more than anyone, was in someone else's arms. At least that's what the image told him, and he believed it. Not because he wanted to, but because deep down, he was still the man who once believed everything had a price, and love was too rare to be real. The image was quiet, but it screamed a photo of Isla in another man's arms, their eyes soft, too soft. And beneath it, a fabricated message. I can't wait until the contract ends. He suspects nothing. Julian's heart cracked, not loud, not sudden, but the way glass gives in. After too much pressure, silently, irreversibly, he sat in the dark, the city lights painting patterns on the walls. The message glowed from his phone, like a cruel echo. He'd opened his heart. For the first time, he'd believed she was different. And now his jaw tightened, his hands trembled. But his eyes turned to stone. Isla returned home past midnight. The hospital had drained her emotionally, physically. But Lila was stable tonight, and for a moment, hope had kept her afloat. She stepped into the penthouse quietly, the scent of leftover soup still lingering. She saw Julian by the window, his silhouette carved against the skyline. Julian, she called softly. He didn't turn, didn't speak. He just reached out and dropped the photo on the table. Her heart froze. She stepped forward, picked it up, and instantly recognized it. Ethan. The hug, that fleeting, broken moment in the hospital hallway, when he comforted her while she cried for her sister, but the image had been twisted light and angles altered, shadows stretched. It looked like a secret, a betrayal. This is Ethan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's my oldest friend. That day I was falling apart, and he just, I know what I see. Julian snapped his voice like thunder on glass. You think I'm a fool. His voice shook now. Not just with rage, but with hurt. You played it perfectly, sweet, selfless, convenient. And all the while, he pointed at the photo. This. Isla shook her head, tears brimming. No, no, Julian, please, I trusted you, he said, his voice low and raw. And I don't trust anyone. Her heart broke at the sound of that truth. She stepped closer, reaching for him. Let me explain, please. He recoiled as if her touch burned. You wanted money for your sister, he said coldly. You got it. You lived in comfort. You played the part. Congratulations. The words were knives. I didn't want any of this. Isla, whispered, voice cracking. I didn't want your money. I didn't want your name. She paused. She couldn't say it. Not now. Not like this. He looked away. The contract's over, Julian said. Leave. Her breath caught. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just let her go. Isla didn't fight. She packed in silence. A few clothes. Lila's photo. Her favorite book, Anne of Green Gables, the pages worn from nights of escape. She left behind every dress, every gift, every trace of the life they'd built together. Not out of pride, but because it hurt too much to carry pieces of a love that was never believed. At the door, she paused. He still had his back to her. I never wanted your empire, she said softly. I only wanted you to believe in me. He didn't turn, didn't say a word, and so she left. The sound of the door closing behind her, like a final chapter, torn from the spine. Outside, the wind was sharp, the night heavy. Isla stepped into the cold with nothing but her heartbreak. She didn't know that the days ahead would be darker, colder. She only knew that the man she'd fallen for, the man who had once given her daisies and paper cranes and silent comfort, had just broken her in half, and high above the city, Julian Hale stood in the silence of his penthouse, clutching the photo, not because he still believed it, But because he needed something to hold, while everything inside him came undone, he told himself he was right, that she was like the rest, that love was a lie. But no lie had ever hurt this much. In the silence that followed her departure, Julian Hale stood frozen by the window. City lights, flickering far below, unable to silence the voice within him, a small voice, the one that whispered, "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life." In her penthouse uptown, Sophie Hale sipped champagne and smiled with satisfaction. She had done what she believed was right, protected her brother from someone she thought was using him, but she didn't see the full cost of her victory. She didn't know that the lie she'd planted had not only destroyed Isla, it was pulling Julian into an abyss of regret he would never fully climb out of. That night, Isla stepped into the winter air, the door behind her shutting like the end of a chapter. She didn't cry, didn't turn back. She walked nowhere in particular, just away. Away from the man who had once looked at her like she mattered. Away from the hope she had carefully, quietly let grow. The wind bit at her skin, but she felt nothing. Her heart had already gone numb. "You're just like the rest." His voice echoed in her mind. Just another name to add to the long list of people who didn't believe in her. She returned to her old apartment in Eastwood, the one-bedroom flat with its flickering light bulbs and peeling walls. It had once been her haven. Now it was just a room filled with silence. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a photo of Leela, the last remnant of the only thing she had ever lived for. She wanted to call her, to hear her laugh, but she couldn't bear the thought of breaking down and not being able to pick herself back up, so she sat and stared. And the world kept turning without her. 3 days later, the call came. It shattered everything. The doctor's voice on the other end trembled. There were complications. We tried everything, but Lila was gone, just like that. One breath, one heartbeat, then nothing. Isla dropped the phone. Her knees hit the ground. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Only silence. Only grief. She went to the hospital. Each step felt like dragging the weight of a lifetime behind her. When she reached the room, her little sister lay still, too still. Her skin, pale lips slightly parted, as if she were just sleeping. Isla reached for her hand. Cold, a sob escaped her chest. Not loud, but raw. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking in half. "I promised I'd protect you, and I failed." She didn't move for hours. She just sat there, holding onto a hand that could no longer hold back. After the funeral, Isla returned to her apartment. But she didn't return to herself. She went to work at a small cafe, took night shifts, washed dishes, served strangers with a polite nod, but she no longer smiled. She no longer sang, didn't read, didn't dream. She threw away the photo of her and Lila. She couldn't bear to look at it anymore. Each glance felt like a knife twisting deeper, so she buried the memories, and with them, herself. "She's like a ghost," one coworker whispered, and it was true. The girl with the soft eyes and unshakable resilience was gone. All that remained was a shadow, a shell, a quiet figure, moving through life on autopilot. 2 months later, Julian Hale stood in his corner office, the skyline stretching endlessly before him, but he saw nothing. Only the space where she used to be. The skyline still glittered beneath him, but Julian Hale, once a man mesmerized by the heights of Manhattan, now found no beauty in it. The city hadn't changed, but he had. Since the night Isla walked out of his life, the penthouse had become a tomb. Every room echoed with what wasn't said. Every silence grew heavier than the last. He told himself he had been right, that she had betrayed him, that she used him, lied to him, but no matter how many times he repeated it, he couldn't silence the ache. The vase of white daisies, now wilted and dry, remained tucked away in a cabinet. He couldn't bring himself to throw them out. They were a reminder of what he'd once had and what he'd thrown away. The truth came without warning. An anonymous email a former employee of Sophie's subject line. You need to see this. Attached the original photo untouched. Just Isla and Ethan. A simple hug in a hospital hallway. No intimacy, no secrets, just kindness and grief. Then came the invoice records. For the private investigator, for the image editor, for the forged messages. Julian sat frozen, the phone trembling in his hands. He couldn't breathe. He stormed into Sophie's apartment, his voice always cool and measured, now shook with fury. Why? He demanded. Why would you do this? Sophie's confident exterior crumbled under the weight of his gaze. I I thought I was protecting you, she whispered. She didn't belong with us, Julian. I thought she'd hurt you. He stepped back as if struck. She was the only thing that ever made me feel whole, he said, his voice barely a whisper now, and you destroyed her. And he left without another word, and he never looked back. Julian gave up everything. He walked away from the company, stepped down from every board, cut ties with his family, even Sophie. All the things that once defined him, power, wealth, prestige, now felt meaningless. There was only one thing that mattered now, finding Isla, not to fix the past, not to win her back, but to look into her eyes and tell her I was wrong, but she was gone. Her old apartment was empty. She no longer worked at the cafe. No one had seen her. He searched everywhere, the bakery, the hospital, the parks. He checked the hospital's records, and his knees nearly buckled when he learned the truth. Lila was gone. Just days after Isla left, she had lost him, and then she had lost her sister. Her entire world had crumbled, and he had pushed her straight into it. A single lead brought him to a small town hours away. A former coworker mentioned Isla had packed a single bag. No forwarding address, no goodbyes. She just disappeared. But Julian didn't stop. He drove for hours, wandering through towns with faded signs and quiet streets, asking in bookstores, cafes, second-hand shops. He didn't know what he'd say. If he ever found her, didn't expect forgiveness. He just wanted to know that she was still breathing, that the girl with the daisy smile hadn't disappeared forever. Back in the penthouse, everything remained untouched. Except for the vase of daisies, now brittle petals, curling inward, like forgotten promises, and Julian, once the untouchable CEO, stood alone, just a man, just a heartbroken soul, who had burned down the one thing that had made him feel alive. He didn't know if he could fix it, but he knew this: he would never stop searching, even if it took a lifetime to find her again, even if she never looked at him the same way. He would carry her love and his guilt forever. Rain fell like a confession over the forgotten town of Havenwood. Gray skies hung low over weather-beaten houses, and dirt roads turned to sludge. The air smelled of damp earth and quiet sorrows. On the sidewalk, soaked through, and shivering, stood a man no one recognized. Not the Julian Hale they'd seen in business magazines, not the powerful CEO in tailored suits, just a man now drenched, broken, and searching. It had been 2 months since the truth shattered his world. 2 months since he learned that the woman he loved had never betrayed him. He had given everything up: the company, the title, his family. He wandered through every inch of the city, followed every whisper, knocked on every door, and now that trail had led him here to a town time seemed to forget. To her, the only cafe on Main Street was called the Rusty Spoon, its flickering sign barely holding on. Inside, the air was warmer, smelled of cinnamon and coffee. Julian stepped in, rain dripping from his coat, onto the worn floorboards. Then he saw her, and time stopped. Isla. She stood behind the counter, a faded green apron around her waist. Her hair was tied loosely, damp strands clinging to her cheeks. She was wiping a glass slowly, as if she wasn't really there. The Isla he remembered, the one who hummed in kitchens and folded paper cranes, was gone. This woman before him was a shadow, pale hollow. Her eyes no longer sparkled. They just existed. Julian didn't move. Couldn't. The pain of seeing her like that, knowing he had done this, he had extinguished that light, was unbearable. A coworker leaned in, whispered something. Isla nodded without looking up. She didn't know he was there, and somehow that hurt the most. He stumbled back outside. Heart-pounding breath, catching in his chest. The rain hadn't stopped. It soaked him again, but he didn't care. He waited, stood in the cold, watching the back alley behind the cafe, hoping, praying. When she finally appeared, the world slowed. Isla stepped out, holding a thin coat, close, a small umbrella, barely shielding her. She didn't look around. She didn't see him. She just walked, shoulders bent, eyes to the ground, as if there was nothing left worth noticing. Isla. His voice broke through the sound of the storm. She stopped. She didn't turn, but her fingers clutched the umbrella tighter. He ran toward her, splashing through puddles, his chest aching with a fear he couldn't name. Isla, please. Look at me. Slowly, she turned. Their eyes met. And Julian Hale, once the master of deals and empires, felt something inside him break, because the woman he loved looked at him like a stranger. There was no fury in her gaze, no sorrow, not even pain, just an emptiness, so vast it made the rain seem quiet. She saw him, but she didn't see him. As if he were a dream, she had already forgotten Isla. He whispered. But the girl he once knew, the girl with sun in her smile, was gone, and the man who had driven her away had no idea if he could ever bring her back. I've been searching for you everywhere. His voice trembled as the rain slid down his face, blending with tears he didn't try to hide. I was wrong, Isla. About everything, Sophie. She lied. She forged the messages, the photo, all of it. She didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't move. The rain soaked her hair, her coat clung to her frame, but her eyes, they were still distant, a sea with no current. Julian stepped forward, every step feeling like glass beneath his feet. I know I don't deserve anything, he said. I know I broke what we had, but if there's the smallest piece left, please let me try to make it right. He sank to his knees, right there in the mud, in the cold, in the same street where she walked like a ghost now. If you can't love me any more, he whispered, then let me love you, even from a distance. I won't ask for anything else. He looked up at her eyes, raw, but she didn't cry, didn't flinch. Her expression was empty, not cruel, but carved by loss too deep for anger. Julian's heart shattered because she wasn't rejecting him. She was already gone, not in body, but in soul. Isla. His voice cracked. Say something. Anything. Yell at me. Tell me to leave. But she didn't. She simply turned and walked away. Her figure slowly faded into the curtain of rain, and Julian stayed on his knees. Alone, he didn't leave Havenwood. Not that night, not the day after. Not even when he realized she may never speak to him again. He rented a modest house at the edge of town. No assistants, no chauffeurs, no board meetings, just a man with muddy boots and a heart full of what-ifs. Every morning he walked to the cafe, not to speak, just to sit. In the far corner, always the same seat, a cup of coffee cooling, untouched before him. And Isla, she never looked his way, but she knew, she felt the weight of his gaze, not expectant, not demanding, just there, unmoving. Like the love he still carried, she didn't have it in her to confront him. Not after everything, not after losing Lila, not after losing herself. She had no anger left to give, no forgiveness to offer, no fire, no light, no song, only silence. She existed, nothing more. Each day was a page she barely turned. Work, walk home, sleep, repeat. And in the background, he remained, never intruding, never leaving. Julian understood he wasn't there to win her back. He was there because he couldn't be anywhere else. She was his world, even if he was no longer hers. The pain between them wasn't cruel anymore. It was quiet heavy, like a wound that stopped bleeding, but never stopped aching. The rain in Havenwood had finally eased, but winter still lingered, in the air, in her eyes, in his waiting, and so Julian Hale, once the king of skyscrapers, now walked muddy roads in flannel shirts, not to chase power, but to offer love that asked for nothing. Love that waited. Love that stayed after that night, the night he knelt in the rain and begged for forgiveness. Ela Reed remained a shadow. She moved through her days like mist, present but unreachable. At the Rusty Spoon Cafe, she poured coffee and wiped tables with hands that no longer remembered how to feel. She spoke little, smiled never. She wasn't angry anymore, just tired, tired of losing, tired of feeling. She knew Julian Hale was in Havenwood, saw him in the corner booth each morning, his presence steady and silent. But she never looked directly at him, never spoke. He belonged to a past too painful to revisit. Yet somehow, despite everything, her heart stirred faintly each time he was near. Julian didn't approach, didn't press. He knew no apology, no matter how desperate, could erase the hurt he'd caused. So he stayed. Quietly, often not to win her back, but simply to care. It began with a roof. He'd noticed the small wooden house she rented on the town's edge. One morning, a storm passed through, and he saw the leak. He didn't ask, didn't leave a name, just bought the materials, learned from a local carpenter, and fixed it himself under the soft morning sun. When Isla returned, the roof was dry. A folded note on her step read, "Fixed." She stared at it. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she said nothing, just stepped inside. Then came the path he'd watched her walk home each night along a dark, winding stretch of road. So he installed small solar lamps, one by one along the trail. No signature, no mention, just light, where there had once been shadow. She often forgot lunch, so each morning Julian left a sandwich box by the cafe door. No note, no claim, just food, wrapped in care. She ate silently, but when she did, Julian's heart beat a little faster. One day when the cafe's kitchen helper called out sick, Julian offered to step in. He couldn't cook, but he tried. He burned toast, overboiled pasta, nearly sliced his own finger, and still he stayed. Behind the counter, Isla saw it all, the disheveled hair up, the awkward way he held a knife, the sweat glistening on a man once untouchable. She never said a word, but sometimes her gaze lingered, as if asking, "Why are you still here?" He learned to cook, not well, but with heart. One night as she cleaned the counters, Julian left a plate of spaghetti by the register. The sauce was uneven, the noodles slightly overdone. A note beside it read, "You need to eat something." Isla stared, and then for the first time in months, her lips curved. A smile? Small, faint, fleeting, but real, Julian. Watching from the doorway, felt something burst in his chest. After that, he began leaving flowers, wild ones, picked from the fields outside town, daisies, bellflowers, a few stems of clover, tied together with twine, left at her door, or the cafe counter. No names, no messages, just offerings. Weeks passed, months. Then one late afternoon, something changed. Julian stood outside the cafe, holding a small crumpled bouquet, and this time, instead of waiting, he held it out directly to her. Isla paused. She looked at him, really looked. Her fingers brushed his as she took the flowers. She studied them, imperfect, slightly, wilted and smiled. Not like the old Isla, but like someone remembering what warmth used to feel like thank you, she whispered. Her voice was quiet, but true. Julian didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, holding on to the silence, as if afraid the moment might vanish if he breathed too deeply. But it didn't vanish. It stayed, like the first fragile sign of spring. After a bitter, endless winter, it began with a smile, small, barely there, but enough to plant a seed. From that day on, Isla, Reed began to change. Slowly, she no longer avoided Julian Hale's gaze when they crossed paths behind the cafe counter. She started saying things again, not much. Just small everyday words, coffee's strong today, or you burn the toast again to anyone else. They were ordinary, but to Julian, they were miracles. He asked for nothing more, didn't ask her to forgive, didn't ask her to feel anything for him again. He just wanted her to live, whether that life included him or not. Spring arrived in Havenwood, brushing the town with sunlight and soft green. The fields breathed wildflowers. The skies stretched bluer, and Isla began to find pieces of herself again. One afternoon, she carried an old sketchbook to the meadow near the edge of town. She sat beneath a crooked oak tree, her fingers unsure as they pressed pencil to paper. Her first drawing was clumsy, lines hesitant, but she kept sketching wildflowers, the curve of the dirt road. The rooftops of Havenwood silhouetted against the light. Julian watched from a distance, his heart aching, but this time it wasn't from sorrow, it was hope. She began teaching art to children at the community center. Every Tuesday and Thursday, her soft voice filled the quiet room with gentle guidance. Draw what makes you feel warm. Inside, she'd say. And the children laughed, and she smiled with them, still tinged with sadness. Yes, but her smile had returned. Julian never stepped inside. He stood by the window, watching her, surrounded by crayons, laughter, and healing. He still didn't speak of the past, still didn't ask for anything. He just showed up. He fixed the jammed window in her home, repainted her garden fence, learned how to bake lopsided cookies from the cafe's owner, not for praise, just to bring to her class. When the children stayed late, he stopped hoping for her love. He just hoped she'd keep smiling. A full year passed, and the Isla that had once disappeared into grief was slowly, tenderly returning. Her eyes, once dull now, caught the sunlight again, her cheeks a little fuller, her steps less weighed down. She painted more, hung her art around her little house. Drew dreams again. Julian, in his modest, rented home, kept a bouquet of dried wildflowers in a glass jar, the first she'd ever taken from his hands. He didn't know if she would ever love him again, but he didn't need to. Loving her quietly was enough. Isla began to notice things. How the light on her porch stayed fixed because someone had changed the bulb. How flowers appeared at her doorstep. Never extravagant, just wild and real. How a man in a flannel shirt stood in the rain with a second umbrella and never said a word unless she accepted it first. She wasn't ready to forgive, wasn't ready to open her heart, but for the first time, she didn't want him to leave. One soft afternoon, as spring wrapped Havenwood in golden breath, Julian approached her after art class, in his hands a small crumpled sketch, a single daisy drawn with an unsteady hand. She looked at it, laughed clear and light, the sound ringing across the field. "You're terrible at this," she teased, but she kept the drawing, tucked it gently into her sketchbook. Her fingers lingered on the pencil lines. And Julian, breath held heart full, knew they had begun something again. Not a romance, not yet, but a restoration of two hearts, of two lives. That spring, Havenwood bloomed like never before. Daisies swayed in the breeze, children ran barefoot in fields. And Isla stood among it all in a simple white dress, her hair loose. Sunlight dancing through each strand. She wasn't the same girl he had fallen in love with. She was more, and he would wait as long as it took to love her fully and freely whenever she was ready. The wind whispered through the wildflower field, tugging gently at the strands of her hair, sending them dancing like silk threads in the light. Isla. Reed sat quietly beneath the afternoon sun, her sketchbook open in her lap. Pencil strokes traced the rolling hills, the soft sway of daisies, the golden silence of spring. A year had passed since she came to Havenwood. A year since she'd been found, not as the girl she used to be, but as someone quietly learning how to live again. She was not the radiant Isla of before, but something deeper, someone who had survived. And in that survival, she'd found strength. From a distance, Julian Hale watched her as he had 100 times before, not with longing, not with expectation, but with awe. He was no longer the man who had ruled boardrooms with icy calm, no longer the name whispered in corridors of power. Now he was just a man in a worn shirt and muddy boots, a man who fixed fences, baked uneven cookies, and waited patiently. With a wildflower crown trembling in his hand, today he took a breath and walked across the field through the grass and sunlight toward the woman who had once shattered him and whom he had shattered in return. She looked up at the sound of his steps. Their eyes met. Her smile was soft, the corners of her lips curved in a way that said, "You're welcome here now," though. A ghost of sadness still lingered. "Picking flowers again?" she asked gently. Julian didn't answer. Instead, he knelt, right there in the wild grass. The crown of daisies and reeds, imperfectly tied, a little wilted, shook slightly in his hands. Her breath caught Julian. She whispered. He looked up and began, his voice quiet but sure. "I've said, I'm sorry, 1,000 ways, 1,000 times, but no apology could ever undo what I've done. So I won't say it again. Not today. Today I just want to tell you the truth." He held the flower crown to his chest like something sacred. "I don't ask you to forget or to forgive. I only ask to walk beside you for as long as you'll let me." Tears traced the lines of Isla's cheeks, but she didn't look away. She didn't step back. She let him speak. "I can't offer you the world," he said softly, "because I know the world has taken too much from you, but I can offer you this, a life, quiet, real, and full of love. Even if that love begins as friendship, even if it begins with silence." He lifted the crown toward her, hands shaking. "Let me spend my days making you smile, even if it's only once a week, even if you never say the words back. I love you, Isla. I'll love you in ways that don't ask anything in return." The breeze curled through the grass, carrying memories, and maybe forgiveness. Isla stood there still and quiet, but in her eyes, once empty now, shimmered 1,000 emotions. She remembered the loneliness. The night she stood in the rain as he begged. The silence, the days she could not breathe without pain. She remembered his distance, his presence, his unspoken love, the flowers, the repairs, the drawing of a daisy, crooked but heartfelt, the way he never once said, "Love me, only ever, I'm here." She looked at the man on his knees, not the man from a lifetime ago, the man who stayed, and her voice when it came was soft as the wind. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said barely above a whisper, "but I know this." She reached out, touched the flower crown in his hands. "I don't want you to leave." Julian closed his eyes, let the weight of those words settle into the quiet earth. And when he opened them again, there was no more pleading, only peace, because love, the kind that lasts, doesn't rush, it waits. And finally the waiting was beginning to bloom. She stepped forward slowly. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and the sunlight played gently across her face, now streaked with silent tears. Isla. Reed stood still for a moment, her hands trembling, not from fear but from the weight of a heart rediscovering how to feel. Julian looked up, afraid to even breathe. He was no longer the man who had broken her. Now he was simply a man, waiting, hoping, holding love in his palms like something fragile and sacred. Hila's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "You hurt me," she said, "but somehow you brought me back." She paused. "I don't know if I can love the way I used to, but I do know this. I don't want to imagine my life without you in it." Julian's breath caught. The wildflower crown slipped from his fingers and landed gently in the grass between them, but he didn't care. He reached for her, and when she didn't pull away, he pulled her into his arms, not like someone claiming, but like someone coming home. "I'll wait," he whispered into her hair. "However long it takes, however you need me, I'll wait. Just let me walk with you." Isla leaned back just enough to look into his eyes. Then without a word, she lifted her wrist. He understood. He picked up the fallen crown, a little bent, petals crumpled but still beautiful, and slipped it over her wrist. It wasn't a ring, but it was a vow. "Yes," she said. "Let's build something new together." They stood in the sun-drenched meadow, the wildflowers swaying like quiet witnesses, no grand speeches, no audience, no contracts. Just two hearts, once broken, now choosing each other freely. Choosing to try again, not because it was easy, but because it was real. Julian kissed her forehead, soft, reverent, as if afraid to wake from a dream, and Isla pressed her face to his chest, her heartbeat finally steady. The past was still there, folded gently into the pages of their story, but it no longer defined them. They didn't need to fix what was lost. They only needed to write what came next. Together, the wildflower field, the sunlight, and the quiet wind all bore witness that day. Not every love survives the storm, but some love the kind that waits, the kind that stays, blooms again in the spring. Thank you, dear listeners, for walking with us through this journey of love loss and healing. This story was not just about two people finding each other. It was about learning to forgive, to grow, and to open our hearts again, even when it hurts. We hope that somewhere along the way, it reminded you that no matter how dark the night may be, morning always comes, and with it, the chance to begin again. If this story touched you, even just a little, then we've done what we came here to do. From all of us at Shining Stories, thank you for your time, your presence, and your heart. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and never stop believing in the power of quiet love.